What is up, guys? It is your boy Steady Chaos. So we're gonna do what we do best on this channel, and that's talk LG OLEDs. Let's do it. Alright guys, so it's that time of year again. Every March, April, the new crop of TVs comes out, and LG OLEDs are no different. So we have the release of the C1, and of course last year, one of the most popular questions people had was, should I get the 2020 model, the C10, or should I get the 2019 model, the C9? And the year before that, it was the same thing. Should I get the C9 or should I get the C8? And here we are, now the LG C1 is out, so people are asking, should I get the brand new LG C1 or should I maybe get the 2020 model, the LG C10, which could be a better value and slightly cheaper? So what should I do? Are the TVs exactly the same? Do they perform differently? Is the C1 really an upgrade over the C10, or am I simply wasting my money? Especially if I already have an LG C10, am I wasting my money going to an LG C1? Alright, so one thing I should say first of all is this is a specific spec comparison between the two TVs using the website rtings.com. We're going to go through all the C10 and C1 spec ratings for the various tests that Rtings has done, and we're going to compare them to see which TV performs better. We're going to get right down into the nitty-gritty, the minutia of the numbers. So this is going to be a very detail-oriented, somewhat technical video, and it's going to be pretty long. So strap in, buckle up, because we're about to really dive into this. It's probably going to be a solid 30 to 40 minute video. Again, all credit goes to Rtings for these reviews. I will have a link to their website in the description below if you want to go check them out. All right, so what we're going to do is I have them set up side by side here. The C10 is on your left, the C1 is on your right. So let's scroll down to style and stand. Okay. Now, the LG C9, C10, C1, they all have the exact same stand, and they all have the exact same build and style that has not changed throughout the last several years. So if you scroll, you can see here, the TVs look exactly the same. They have the same V-shaped stand right here. If you scroll down to the build quality, they're both a 9.0, the same materials, the same build, so nothing really to see here. Again, the C10 on your left, the C1 on your right. So Rtings measures the contrast of every single television. So because these OLED TVs are organic light emitting diodes, or they are self-emissive, that means they basically have an infinite to 1 contrast ratio. That's the biggest strength of an OLED TV, is the fact that its blacks are inky black. So that gives it that brilliant contrast ratio. That's why you see the C10 scores a 10 on contrast, as well as the C1, and that's to be expected. But where you see a little bit of difference here is in the SDR brightness. Now keep in mind, when you see some differences in brightness or pixel response time or input lag, things like that, it can be a fundamental difference between the two televisions. One might be better than the other. But it also could be a situation where there's a little bit of panel variance. They're made the same way, but ultimately their ability to display color or brightness can vary by panel. Usually they're small variances, but it's just a disclaimer. I just wanted to let you guys know that there certainly can be what's known as panel variance. So with that in mind, let's see if we can see any kind of trends here between the two televisions. So Rtings gives the SDR brightness of the C10 a 7 out of 10, and then the C1 a 6.5 out of 10. So you see the C1 does not appear to be as bright as the C10. So real scene peak brightness in SDR is all you really need to concern yourself with. You want to know how bright that TV is going to be when you're watching real content like a movie or a TV show. And on average, it's 321 nits, okay, the C10. The C1, curiously, is 278 nits, so it's a step back, it would seem. Again, is this panel variance? Usually panel variance, you're talking 10, 20, maybe 30 nits. This is a full, you're talking almost a full, 43 nits, almost 50 nits difference. That could be systemic in all LG C1s, that they're simply not quite as bright as the C10. I'm not really sure. We did see that with the C10 model, where it wasn't quite as bright as the C9 model. So who knows? It could be the case here. If you look at a 2% and 10% window on the C10, you're talking 460 and 456 nits. Over here on the C1, it's only 362 and 375. So you're looking at a little bit of a step back for sure on the C1. So now let's move down to the next test, local dimming. With local dimming, what most people think of as an LED LCD with a full array local dimming backlight system. Usually the more dimming zones you have, the better light control the TV has, the better contrast it has, the better local dimming it has. But with an organic light emitting diode TV or an OLED like the C10 and C1 are, you don't really have to concern yourself with local dimming because every single pixel is self-emissive like we talked about. So of course the C10 and the C1 are all going to score a 10 out of 10 on this. But the important thing is here is the HDR brightness. So the C10 is measured in real scene HDR brightness TV movie watching at 681 nits. The C1 a little bit lower, again, just like SDR, at 626 nits. So that's a little bit disappointing. Hard to say whether or not it's panel variance. You look at HDR brightness in game mode, the C10 is 563 nits. The C1 is 594. So a small victory there for the C1 in game mode. But then when you start looking at the 2 and 10% windows, 749, 804 on the C10, 686 and 714 on the C1. And the important thing to note here is if you look at the EOTF curve, ideally a TV will come as close as possible to that EOTF curve to be accurate in HDR mode. You see the C10 here is very accurate with a roll-off at its peak brightness. In game mode, there's a little bit of deviation from the curve, but for the most part, again, very accurate. And the same here in the C1, very accurate here. And then in game mode, it undershoots a little bit in dark areas, which will probably be corrected with a future firmware update. But for the most part, though, it follows the EOTF curve perfectly. So overall, when looking at SDR brightness and HDR brightness between the C1 and the C10, I'd say the C1 is slightly dimmer here. But again, it's hard to say if the C1 actually is dimmer or it's simply panel variance. My guess is that it's probably a little bit of panel variance here. And overall, the differences between the C10 and C1 in terms of HDR performance are pretty much nil. They're pretty much the same. That's how I see it. Now, you come down to gray uniformity. Now, ideally, you want, whenever you talk about standard deviation, what Artings is talking about here, so you see 50% standard deviation, 50% dirty screen effect, same over here. You want these numbers, you see here, 1.280, 1.56, 1.526. You want those numbers to be lower. That means there's less standard deviation or deviation from what a perfect score would be. Most of the time, no TV is going to have a perfect value, but you don't want the TV to deviate too far from said perfect value. So generally, the lower numbers you see here when comparing the C1 and C10, then the better. So 50% standard deviation, what that means is the average square difference of pixels when displaying a mid 50% gray. So you want it to look consistently gray. You don't want dark spots or blotches, anything like that. And the standard deviation is 1.526 on the C10. Anything below, you see here on the screen, that 2.5% is a good value. So the C10 is in a good value here. Now, the C1 has slightly less standard deviation at 1.28, so that means it has a slightly cleaner image, maybe. It's not something you would probably notice in real-world viewing. So that is why the C10 only scores an 8.4 and the C1 an 8.7. So that's a win for the C1. That's good. And then you start talking about black uniformity. Of course, again, I'm going to beat this topic like a dead horse, but this is an organic light-emitting diode. The pixels are able to illuminate themselves on a per-pixel basis, meaning that if you need a pixel to be black, then it can just simply turn itself off. That is why the black uniformity is absolutely perfect on the C10 and the C1. You see here, since this OLED TV can turn off pixels, individual pixels, the black uniformity is perfect. Because the LG C1 can turn off pixels individually, it has near perfect black uniformity. So no surprise there. But chalk this up as a minor win for the C1 in that it has slightly cleaner gray uniformity. But again, keep in mind panel variance. All right, viewing angles. Typically, viewing angles are very, very good on OLEDs. But this is where, again, you see a small win for the C1. 8.4 on the C10, it's rated, and 8.9 on the C1. Reflections are exactly the same. Probably the same anti-reflective properties used in both the C10 and C1. That's why they score the same. But if you talk about viewing angle, You look here at color washout. What degrees off angle do the colors start to wash out? At 48 degrees, the C10 started to wash out. You have to get to 57 degrees on the C1 for the colors to wash out. So you want that to be higher. That means you can sit further off angle without that color washout. So the C1 is slightly better here. Now when you start talking about color shift, they're both pretty much the same, 32 degrees and 30 degrees. No perceptible difference there. And then you come down here and you look at brightness loss, black level raise, and gamma shift. You don't want to be sitting off angle and experiencing brightness loss or black level raise, kind of your blacks turn gray, look washed out, or gamma shifting. So with the C10 at 62 degrees, 70 degrees, and 57 degrees, you experience those issues. With the C1 at 69 degrees, 70 degrees, and 64 degrees, you experience those issues. So the C1 does perform slightly better, brightness loss 62 to 69, so a 7-degree difference there. Black level raise at both 70, and then gamma shift 57 to 64, so a 7-degree difference there. So the C1 is slightly better with off-angle viewing. So if you have yourself a living room, a large living room with a lot of kind of seating that envelops the TV on both sides, then an OLED panel, whether you're getting the C10 or C1, even though the C1 scored a little better here, you can't go wrong with either. It has great off-angle viewing for both. Now, pre-calibration and post-calibration. This is really strange, this one, in my opinion. I'm not really sure what's going on here. Again, you don't want a lot of deviation in any of your picture values here. So, pre-calibration for the C10 is an 8.2. That's a good score. For the C1, curiously, it's a 4.6. Now again, panel variance could be at play here, but usually with panel variance, like we said earlier, you're not talking about a large departure from the norm. Maybe, a few points off here or there. You're talking about HDR brightness, a couple nits brighter here or there. But usually panel variance is pretty small. Usually you don't see something like this where pre-calibration on the C1, it scores that much worse than the C10. 8.2 and then the C1 a 4.6. So you're talking about a lot of deviation here in the white balance and color performance. So let's take a look at the numbers here. If you look at this line, this is the ideal line, kind of like the EOTF curve, that you want your TV to follow. So you see here there are less peaks and valleys with the C10. If you look at the C1, look at it, it's all over the place. You got a huge dip here, you're riding high over here. That is not a good sign. That is not a good sign, because one thing I will say is that a lot of people, like probably 99% of people really, or at least 95% of people, they don't have calibration equipment. So a lot of times these people are going to be using the pre-calibration settings that came with their TV. They don't have Calman, they're not professional calibrators. They're not calibrating their display. I haven't even calibrated my display, and I'm pretty hardcore into TVs. So white balance, DE, so average inaccuracy of shades of gray, okay? A good score is less than 3, so the C10 got a 2.47. The C1 has a 5.86. That is a very poor score. If you look at this sort of graph, we have the red right here. You can see my mouse. I'll point at it with my mouse. You see right here? The red, this is kind of how this score falls on an overall spectrum of TVs that have been reviewed. If you're in the red area, that's not good. If you're in the yellow area, you're mediocre. If you're in the green area, that's a good score. So you see here, the C1 is falling way off into the red area. This is a very, very poor score. And, a noticeable difference is 1 point. So you have 5.86, and over here on the C10, you have 2.47. And if you look where its score falls on this chart, it falls in the green area. It's a very, very good score. So there's not a lot of deviation or inaccuracy of shades of gray on the C10, whereas the C1 pre-calibration is all over the place. That is not a good sign. And what's even more troubling is color deviation. You look down here, a good value is below 3. The C10 is a 1.77. The C1 is a 5.13. Look where that score falls on the chart. Again, in the red on the C10, all the way over here on the green. One of the better scored TVs on rtings.com. Gamma is the same. That's good. 2.19 and 2.21. A good score being between 2.1 and 2.3. Both these TVs were tested in expert darkroom mode with warm 50 or warm 2, which is basically the same setting, just that the menu systems have changed between the two TVs, and the gamma setting 2.2. So that is not That is not a good sign for the C1, and to me, that does not strike me as panel variance because you're talking about a serious departure here for the C1 compared to the C10. You know, you're talking about a 4.6 score compared to an 8.2 score. That is, it could be panel variance. It could just be that our team's got a particularly poor panel. No matter how you slice it, it looks like the C10 is probably the more accurate performer in terms of, you know, shades of gray, color reproduction, things like that. But you see here, once it's been calibrated, you know, you pretty much have the same score. Deviation 0.16, 0.16, 1, 2, 1.5, 2.2. So very, very close. So that's great that after calibration, the C1 is almost as good as the C10. But the problem is how many people really have calibration equipment? Like I said earlier, how many people are really going to pay to buy the calibration equipment, and then they got to figure out how to use it properly to properly calibrate their TV, or if they don't want to go through that, they have to pay somebody to come in and calibrate, which is really, really surprisingly expensive. So the problem I see here for the C1 is that most people are not going to calibrate their TVs and going to use the pre-calibrated settings, and that means that their grays are going to be all sorts of inaccurate, that their colors are going to be all sorts of inaccurate. That is really, really troubling to see for the C1 there. All right, moving on to upscaling and 4K resolution. You see here between the C10 and the C1, you have an 8, an 8, 8, and 8. They're scored exactly the same. So despite the fact that the LG C1 has the Alpha 9 Gen 4 processor compared to the C10, which has the Alpha 9 Gen 3 processor, you really don't see a major difference in 720p or 1080p upscaling. You see here 1080p, 9 out of 10 for the C10, 9 out of 10 for the C1, and then 4K output, 10 out of 10. 8K input, neither TV accepts or outputs 8K. All right, then moving down to the color gamut. OLEDs have kind of been stuck with DCI P3 at around 97 to 99%, which I shouldn't say stuck because that's pretty much complete coverage. That's perfect, really. But it's with Rec 2020 content here. You see down here, the wider color gamut that OLEDs have kind of been stuck between 70 and 73 or 74% coverage. So I was hoping that they would get closer to 75 to maybe 80% color coverage, but it's hard because OLEDs don't get as bright as LED LCD panels, so they struggle at displaying some of that brighter color coverage. So let's take a look at the DCI P3 values, 97 and 98%. A good value is over 90%, so OLEDs have really, really great DCI P3 coverage. The C10 scores an 8.6 out of 10. The C1, the same thing, 8.6 out of 10. So there's really been no change between the two panels here. You see the C1 96.9 and 99.01. Very, very good values. Again, if you look at the dots here on this chart, ideally all these dots fall into these squares for the colors to be displayed accurately. A lot of the dots are outside of the squares, again indicating that the TV pre-calibration is not very accurate. If you look over at the C10, you'll see that way more of the dots are at least on the edge of the box or in the box. So that means pre-calibration, the C10, as we talked about, is much more accurate. Now you look down at Rec 2020, look, you talked about the C10, 71.6, 75.6. A good value, ideally, you're getting up to 85, 90%. OLEDs just aren't going to do that right now, as they are currently constituted with their brightness. And then if you look at color volume, again, they both score 7.1, so really no departure here for the C1 from the C10. And again, the problem is that the OLEDs don't get bright enough. So if you look at the description, despite having an excellent color gamut, the LG C10's color volume is only decent. It can't produce extremely bright colors, but with an infinite contrast ratio, like we've talked about, it can display dark saturated colors. And the same thing holds true for the C1. Color volume is decent. It's mostly limited by its lower peak brightness. It can produce dark, saturated colors very well thanks to its high contrast ratio, but at higher luminance levels, colors start to wash out. So for example, compared to the ideal 10,000 nit television, which does not exist yet, but say it does, when we compare the C10 against that 10,000 nit television, it can display about 44.2% of the DCI P3 color spectrum. So look, if you look here, it says how much of the DCI P3 color space a TV can display at different luminosity levels when compared to an ideal 10,000 nit TV. So 44.2% of DCI P3. at varying luminosities. And again, that's all because the LG C10 and the C1 for that matter, they top out at about 700 to 800 nits in HDR mode. So yeah, 44.2% DCI-P3 coverage and 43.8% for the C1, pretty much the same. And then, of course, that story gets even worse when you're talking about a wider color gamut like Rec 2020 in comparison to an ideal 10,000 nit TV. The C10 covers about 33.5% of Rec 2020 and the C1 32.9%. So for all intents and purposes, the same. So OLEDs have a long way to go in terms of brightness. They really do. And we really may never see the requisite type of brightness needed to cover more of the DCI P3 and Rec 2020 color gamuts. What we may end up having to wait for is micro LED, which is, they say they're working on it now, some companies, but it's probably 2, 3, 4, 5 years out even. Probably at least 4 or 5 years out for it to be affordable. So we'll see what happens. Now, gradient. A lot of people, and myself included, complained a little bit. I complained in my original LG C10 review that I did last year that some of the gradients, you could see some color banding and some color stepping. Ideally, you want a smooth, clean gradient between, say, you know, if you're looking at a horizon and the sky up high is kind of bright and then the sky down low is kind of a darker blue color. You want that transition to be kind of seamless. You don't want to see steps of color in between, or you don't want to see what's called color banding. The C10 scores an 8.6 and the C1 an 8.4, so very, very close. The C1's a little bit behind here. Again, we're talking about a 10-bit color depth for both, 10-bit panels. And again, we're talking about deviation from what is considered a perfect score. So red, green, and blue, their deviations are 0.08, 0.1, and 0.09. Here it's 0.08, 0.1, and 0.08. So they're pretty much the same. No major differences to speak of here. Gray, 0.08 and 0.11. So a little bit more deviation in gray for the C1 compared to the C10. I have heard from some reviewers that the smooth function in the LG C1's picture settings does a slightly better job at removing color banding compared to the C10 smooth function. But like I said, I don't own the C1 yet, so I have not been able to test it out myself. But once I do own it and do a review, rest assured I will be talking about that. Temporary image retention, neither one really has a major problem with it. The problem is burn-in risk, and that really hasn't changed between the C10 and the C1. They're both rated at 2 out of 10, simply because the risk is there for permanent burn-in. And once you have burn-in, there's no fixing that. The thing I will say about burn-in, though, is newer sets like the C9, the C10, and now the C1, they've gotten better. LG has, Sony has, at combating burn-in, so it's not as frequent of an issue. Less people are reporting it than they did in earlier generations of OLEDs like the C6, C7. So that is good. The technology is evolving. It's becoming more and more mature, and LG is finding ways, and Sony is finding ways to kind of prevent that burn-in using, you know, methods like panel refresh, like we talked about, like, you know, logo luminance adjustment, and those features are very effective. So don't let this score, it looks bad, but don't let this score dissuade you from getting an LG C10 or C1. Like I said, newer models are much less prone to getting burn-in, and you would probably be okay. Of course, you want to take care of your TV. You don't want to, you know, use it as your PC monitor and then not use a screensaver and just let the same screen sit on there for 3-4 hours straight. You do that every day, eventually you probably will get burn-in. So as long as you vary up your content, you watch a little bit of TV here and there, you switch it up to a little bit of movies, you play a little bit of games, as long as you use those anti-burn-in features built into the C10 and C1, like logo luminance adjustment, like pixel shift, like pixel refresher, you'll be fine. But if you're worried, you can always get either TV from Best Buy, and their extended warranty does cover burn-in, so keep that in mind. Response time between the two TVs, no real difference here. 9.9 for the C10, 9.8 for the C1. A good value is anything under 6 milliseconds. OLED panels are super, super fast in their pixel response times. So you see, for an 80% transition, 0.3 milliseconds on the C10, 0.2 milliseconds on the C1. For a 100% pixel transition, which basically means how quickly pixels can fully transition from one color to another, 1.7 milliseconds on the C10, 2.3 milliseconds on the C1. For all intents and purposes, that's exactly the same. You won't notice a difference. So that is why OLEDs are really so good for gaming, because by having such a fast pixel response time, you cut down on the chances that you see any kind of blurring or smudging of the scene. If you have a fast-moving character, sometimes on LED screens you can see like a little bit of blurring or like a trail behind them as they run across the screen. You won't see that on OLEDs. Everything is crystal clear and very responsive between both TVs. So moving on now, black frame insertion. Both TVs can do black frame insertion at 60 Hz and 120 Hz. So really nothing to see here. Both can do motion interpolation. So motion interpolation it's known as a soap opera effect. A lot of people hate that, but you see here, it's an optional feature that increases the frame rate of the video, smoothing movement. So if you have 24p content and you feel like it looks a little bit choppy, you can use some of the picture settings motion interpolation to try to smooth that out. And both TVs offer pretty much the same functions. All right. Stutter. Now, both have pretty much the same stutter score, and both are pretty low, 4.8 for the C10 and 5.0 for the C1, and that's because the inherent technology of OLED and the very, very, very fast pixel response times we just talked about, that means that it can display a frame or an image on screen really, really quickly. So a TV, as you probably know, or maybe you don't know, the way that it produces moving video is very much like a flip book. Imagine like when you're a kid, you have the flip book and every single page has a successive picture, and that when you flip through really, really fast, that makes it look like the picture's moving or the person or character's moving in the book. Same thing with a TV. It just displays those frames one after another, and then it puts them together, and that's what gives the illusion of movement. So the thing, because like we said, OLED screens have such fast pixel response time, they can get that frame on there really, really quick. So if you're talking about 24p content or 24 frames per second, the average amount of time that the C10 will hold a frame on screen per second is 39.9 milliseconds. So it displays a frame, holds it there for 39.9 milliseconds. If it's 24p content, the frame goes away, displays another frame, holds it there for 39.9 seconds. And that's a long time because that pixel refresh is so fast. So that's what makes the TV sometimes with low frame rate content look like it's stuttering. And the same thing pretty much holds true for the LG C1. With 24p or FPS content, it displays a frame on screen for 39.4 milliseconds. That's quite a long time for a frame to be sitting on screen before it goes away in another frame, it takes its place. And of course, if you're talking about 60 FPS content, that's 60 frames per second. On the C10, it's 14.9 milliseconds, it'll hold a frame. And then on the C1, it's 13.4 milliseconds. So you'll get less stutter with high frame rate content because you have more frames per second. So you're not holding a frame on screen as long. So stutter rating between the two is pretty much, for all intents and purposes, identical. And the only time you would really notice stutter is when you're watching movie content at 24p. And of course, like we said earlier, you can always use interpolation to increase it to 60 FPS, which may add the soap opera effect, but it's up to you. I really don't, when I watch a movie, I really don't notice stutter too much. It's one of those things where you, if this is going to be the first OLED you buy, at first you may notice the stutter. And you're like, man, it looks kind of choppy. But after a while, you'll just get used to it. Your eyes get used to it, and it'll become an afterthought. You won't even notice it anymore. And then 24p Judder. 24p Judder. Again, that's kind of a jerkiness that the TV can display when showing low frame rate content, like 24 frame per second movie content. But the C10 and the C1 as well are able to remove this judder by using some of its picture settings, so they both get a 10 out of 10. It's not something you'll notice. So moving on. Now this is where the C1, I think, has a big leg up, and I don't even want to call it a substantial improvement, but it is an improvement for gamers, okay? So both TVs have 120 Hz native refresh rate, so that's 120 frames per second that it can display max, which is great for gaming. They both have VRR, which is variable refresh rate. You see that here. They have HDMI 4 VRR, which is HDMI 2.1 VRR spec. They both can do FreeSync, which is great. AMD's FreeSync. They both can do G-Sync. They are NVIDIA certified. That's great. Now, the big improvement here is when you're looking at any kind of 4K res, 1080p, 1440p res, the variable frame rate kind of range, or VRR range, is 40 hertz or 40 FPS to 120 FPS. So ideally you want your game to stay between 40 and 120 hertz in order for VRR to stay in effect. When you get out, or say your game drops below 40 frames per second, you fall out of that VRR range, and that is when you can start having some issues with tearing, with hitching and stuttering and things like that. The big improvement for the LG C1 is that when you're looking at 4K res, 1080p, 1440p, what have you, now when using an HDMI 2.1 source, the VRR range is between 20 and 120 hertz or frames per second. That is a major improvement. So if you're playing a game on your PC and it's particularly demanding, you're running at 4K, and that game is dropping to 36, 33, even 29 frames per second, it's still going to stay within that VRR range, so you will continue to maintain a relatively smooth performance. You won't have tearing, you shouldn't have too much stuttering. So that's at least a moderate improvement for the LG C1, having the 20 to 120 range as opposed to the 40 to 120 range on the C10. So that's good. Now, another pretty good improvement in terms of gaming for the C1 over the C10, input lag. Both score ridiculously high here anyway, but still, it's worth noting. The C10 9.5 out of 10, the C1 9.7 out of 10. Now you see on average, when you're viewing or consuming 60 Hz content, whether you're using 444 chroma pixel color or you're using HDR 10-bit, it's around 13.5 to 14-ish milliseconds. Obviously, if you're outside of game mode, 97 milliseconds, you don't want to be outside of game mode when you're gaming. But yeah, so 13, 13.8, 13.5, 13.6. Now you look over at the C1, and all those same values are around 10 milliseconds, 10.0, 10.2, 10.2, 10.3. So you're talking about a 3 to 3.5-ish millisecond improvement on the input lag for 60 Hz content. That's not going to be noticeable. If you click on this question mark, a noticeable difference is 15 milliseconds you see down here. 15 milliseconds. So you're only talking about a 3 millisecond, 3.5 millisecond difference. But you know what? If you are a dedicated gamer, if you're a hardcore gamer, even if you're a casual gamer, the lower the input lag, the better. Even if it's not entirely perceptible to you, having a lower input lag is always something that is appreciated by gamers. So it's worth noting here that the C1 is a little bit faster. And then when you start looking at 120 Hz content, 120 frame per second gameplay, on the C10 you have about 7 milliseconds of input lag, 4K 6.7 milliseconds, and then with variable refresh rate in 4K 13.9 milliseconds. Here on the C1 it's a little bit faster here. You see 120 Hz is around 5 milliseconds, 5.3. So about 1.5 milliseconds faster at 120 FPS content. And then a major improvement, 4K with VRR, 5.8 milliseconds compared to the 13.9 milliseconds. So that is about, 7 to 8 milliseconds faster. Again, not the noticeable 15 milliseconds difference you would need to see a difference. But still, anytime input lag's lower, then you're a happy gamer. So that's good. The C1 is slightly better. And another thing, too, to note about the C1, it has what's called the Game Optimizer menu. The C10 does not have this, so it's basically just a built-in picture settings feature for the C1, but it allows you to choose from different presets for various games, like a first-person shooter kind of preset scheme, or like a real-time strategy preset scheme that changes kind of the look of the screen based on the type of content you're playing, which is nice. And then it allows you to engage or disengage VRR, G-Sync, FreeSync, things like that. It allows you to fine-tune the dark areas if you want your shadow dark areas to be darker, or if you want them to be brighter, it allows you to tune that. You can do that on the C10 as well, though. But it's all kind of organized nicely on the C1 in this Game Optimizer menu, which helps to consolidate things, which helps to make the experience a little bit smoother and a little bit better in comparison to the C10. Although, keep in mind, the C10, even though it doesn't have the Game Optimizer menu, it still has G-Sync, it still has FreeSync, it still has a relatively low input lag, it still has a fine-tuned dark area slider. So you're still getting most of the same features of the C10. It's just that the C1 does help to consolidate things and make things a little bit more gamer-friendly. And it also has a prevent input lag delay section in this game optimizer menu, the C1 does. And there are two options according to Arting's, standard and boost. So if you're playing a 60 hertz game and you're getting about 10.3 milliseconds and you want to get it down to say maybe 5.5 milliseconds, what you can do is you can turn the boost mode on the C1 for input lag, and what it does is the TV will interpret a 60 hertz signal like a 120 hertz signal, and it'll allow you to get a slightly lower input lag around, I don't know if it's around the measured 4K 120 5.3 milliseconds here, but it's around like 8 to 9 milliseconds, which is better than the 10 or the 10.2 or 3 you see here. That's something the C10 does not have, the boost function as it pertains to input lag. So a small win here for the C1 for gamers over the C10. But all the supported resolutions are the same. The C10, 1080p, 1440p, 4K at 60 Hz and 120. Over on the C1, 1080p, 1440p, 4K, 60 Hz and 120. And both TVs can display Chroma 444 color in PC mode, which is good. And so that's pretty much it for the specification comparison between these two televisions. Advanced console compatibility. So if you're a PS5 gamer, if you're a Series X gamer, you see here, both TVs can play both consoles at 4K 120 Hertz with HDR. So PS5 4K 120 on the C1, yes. On the C10, PS5 4K 120 HDR, yes. There are no limitations on either TV. And both have HDMI 2.1 ports, 4 of them, I believe. And both TVs are rated for 40 gigabit per second input on those HDMI 2.1 ports, not the full 48. But as we talked about with the C10, this was a whole to-do, hoorah, 10 months ago or 11 months ago when the C10 launched. People were like, oh my god, the C10 does not have 48 gigabits per second. It's not full HDMI 2.1 spec. Well, as we soon realized, you don't need 48 gigabits per second to get 4K 120 hertz, HDR or 10-bit color with Chroma 444. All you need is 40 gigabits per second. So that is why the LG C10 and C1 both cap their HDMI 2.1s at 40 gigabits per second. There won't be any limitations, despite what some people say on the internet. There won't be any limitations for you. You'll be able to game just fine. 4 HDMI inputs on the C10, 4 HDMI inputs on the C1, no difference. And 3 USB, everything is exactly the same. One Ethernet, analog audio out 3.5 millimeter, one on each. Digital optical audio out, one on each. So yeah, no difference there. Audio pass-through, both can do ARC, both can do eARC, Dolby Atmos, True HD, via ARC. The only consistent limitation between the C10 and C1 is it does not do DTS. DTS, no. DTS, no. DTS, no. So this was kind of a big deal last year with the C10. A lot of people were mad that LG dropped DTS support. A lot of other major companies do it as well. Samsung is dropping DTS support. It's just, let's face it, DTS it might sound good still, but it's sort of lost the format war to Dolby. So that is why everybody is just going to Dolby Atmos, Dolby Digital, and DTS is just kind of falling by the wayside. That's just the way it is. And then lastly, we'll just look at the speaker performance between the two. The C10 on the left here, 7.6 frequency response score, and slightly lower on the C1, 7.3. And then on the C10 distortion, 7, and the C1 slightly lower at 6.9. So again, you're looking at deviation here. So standard deviation at 70 decibels. So you want less deviation. So a good score is something below 4. Here it scores at the CX scores at 2.12, and then the C1 scores at 3.57. So slightly higher, slightly more deviation, not ideal. And then if you look at the low frequency extension, ideally you want your speakers to dig down deeper into those lower frequencies so that it can display a punchier or deeper, bassier sound. And the C10 could get down to 63 hertz with its internal speakers. The C1 can only really get down to about 80 hertz, which is not as good. So if you look at the chart down here, it falls somewhere in the middle. It's not terrible, but it falls in this yellow category. If you look at the C10, it falls in the high end of the yellow category, so it's probably not something you're even going to notice. But again, it's slightly worse than the C1. And then you're looking at distortion. Ideally you want less distortion. So if you look at 80 decibels, the amount of distortion, 0.085 for the C10. A good value is anything below 1. So it's definitely a good score for the C10, and then over on the C1, 0.047, a good value below 1. So they're both basically the same in terms of distortion. So in terms of frequency response, I would say that the C10 is marginally better, but this could be panel variance. You never know. Although you're not talking about the panel, you're talking about speakers. Could it be speaker variance? I'm not really sure. I don't know if speakers function the same way panels do in terms of variance, but for all intents and purposes, there's no major difference between the C10 and the C1 in terms of frequency response or distortion. And that's pretty much it. You're talking about the interface, the smart kind of browsing capabilities and apps, etc. of both TVs, both scoring 8.5 out of 10. Both use WebOS. Although I will say the C1 uses the new version 6.0 as opposed to the 5.0 on the C10. But both are scored the same by Arting's ease of use, easy on both, and smoothness average on both. Time taken to select YouTube, 2 seconds, 2 seconds. Time taken to change backlight, 7 seconds and 6 seconds. So slightly faster on the C1, but again, marginal. Advanced options, many on both. So you won't really experience a major operating difference between either WebOS 5 or 6. Apps and features both scored 8 out of 10, pretty much the same. And the remote has had a pretty big overhaul for the C1 in comparison, you see here, to the C10. But both score the same, 9 out of 10, 9 out of 10. Again, how you feel about a remote, how effective you think it is kind of subjective. So I'm not going to put too much weight on this score. But both have the size as large. That really is it. Voice control, many features the same. So that's pretty much going to do it for this review. So if we scroll back up to the top and look at what Artings gave her final score of both the C10 and the C1. Again, the C10 on your left, the C1 on your right. Both mixed usage, 8.8, 8.8 out of 10, exact same score. Movies, 9.3, 9.3. TV shows, 8.2. The C1 slightly lower, 8.1. And that's probably because the C1 isn't quite as bright in either HDR or SDR in comparison to the C10, but the differences were pretty minor. And also, pre-calibration, the C1, as we saw, is not nearly as accurate as the C10. Sports, 8.6, 8.6. Video games, 9.2, 9.2. HDR movies, 8.7. And the C1 slightly lower again at 8.6. And like we just talked about, SDR and HDR brightness is slightly lesser on the C1. Is it panel variance? Who knows? But the fact of the matter is it rated lower here with Artings. HDR gaming, 9. And then on the C1, 9 as well. And then PC monitor usage on the C10, 8.7 out of 10. And then on the C1, 8.9 out of 10. Slightly higher in the C1. And that's probably because it has a wider VRR range, again, 20 to 120 hertz, as opposed to the C10, which is 40 to 120 hertz. And also the input lag is slightly lower on the C1 in comparison to the C10. So that's it, really, guys. You know, after everything we've seen, is the C1 an upgrade over the C10? No, it's not. Yes, it has the Alpha 9 Gen 4 processor compared to the C10 having the Gen 3 processor, but as we saw, upscaling really isn't all that different. The Gen 4 might handle shadow areas a little bit better, or near dark areas a little bit better than the C10 does, but the differences probably wouldn't be perceptible to most in terms of real-world viewing. Brightness is slightly less in the C1 compared to the C10, but again, probably imperceptible to most. Everything else, the risk of burn-in remains the same. The WebOS features are pretty much the same. The pixel response times are pretty much the same. You know, the contrast, the fact that they're both OLED panels is going to be the same. There's no difference in terms of audio reproduction really from either TV. So if you already own a C10, would I recommend you get a C1? No, I wouldn't. I really wouldn't. The only reason you might want to change it up is if you're in my scenario where you have a 55-inch C10 and you use it as a monitor, you sit close, you maybe want to downsize to something a little bit smaller, like the 48-inch C1, something a little bit more manageable, then sure, if you're looking for a 48-inch model, you might as well get the newer one for a couple $100 more. But if you have a 65-inch C10 and you're like, should I get the 65-inch C1? No, there's no reason. There really is no reason. The two TVs perform almost identically. The only real negative for the C1 is the fact that the pre-calibration is so much worse. And that's hard to explain. The common theme is panel variance, but that is a major, major step back for the C1, its pre-calibration performance compared to the C10. So that leads me to believe that maybe there is a legitimate difference between the two panels there. It's hard to say. Maybe you'll get lucky and win the panel lottery and your pre-calibration will be great, but it might be one of those things where if you get a C1 and you are a videophile, if you are really into your TV, you may want to pay the extra dough to have it professionally calibrated, or buy the calibration equipment, which isn't cheap, and learn to calibrate it yourself, which can be somewhat complex for the layman user. The C1 is a minor, very minor iterative change from the C10. It has the better processor, it has the game optimizer menu, but those aren't reasons enough alone to upgrade specifically from a C10. Now, if you don't own an OLED, you've never owned an OLED, you have, say, a 10-year-old LCD TV and you want to jump into OLED, should you get the C10 or the C1? If you are a videophile, if you're hardcore, you're probably not, because you have the 10-year-old LCD TV. You're probably not a videophile. But if you really are into TVs all of a sudden and you have FOMO, fear of missing out, then just get the C1. It's only a few $100 more, maybe like $100 to $300 more for the 55-inch C1 compared to the 55-inch C10. So just get the C1 so you don't have fear of missing out, so that you're getting the latest and greatest. That would be my advice. However, if you just want to jump into OLED and you plan on having this TV for the next 5, 6, 7 years, and you just want a nice OLED, you want a nice new modern TV, but you're not like too concerned about the minutia, then just get the C10 for cheaper. If you can get the 55-inch C10 for $1,500 somewhere, as opposed to say $1,800 or $1,900 for the C1, save yourself $300, $400, $500 on the C10 and get that. All right, guys, that is going to conclude this very lengthy and long dive into the specs of the C10 and C1. Hopefully you have enjoyed this video. Hopefully it's helped you kind of make a decision one way or another if you really want to upgrade to the C1 from the C10, or if you have an older TV and you want to jump into OLED. Hopefully this has helped clarify the performance of both TVs. Hopefully this has helped to show you that ultimately there is no major difference between both sets. Okay, guys? If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section down below. Thank you for staying with me to the end of this video. I know it's been really, really long, but I love to geek out about this stuff. I love to dive into the details, and I like helping you guys too, and then talking with you guys in the comment section. So if you've liked this video, please leave a like, and please subscribe to the channel if you can. And until next time, guys, I will see you later. Peace.